Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're watching this from, and welcome to the 7th conversation in the Language Lives series. Today, John Daniels and I will be interviewing our Language Lives colleague, Mike Byram, Professor Emeritus at the University of Durham, UK. Mike, of course, has featured on the other side of this table in previous interviews. In a moment, I'll ask John to start the conversation, but perhaps I should restate for colleagues who are less familiar the purpose of the Language Live series. It's basically to make available via video recording and transcript the views, experiences of colleagues involved in language education in the UK in particular. And as usual, there'll be 4 themes: how Mike became interested in languages in the first place, significant moments in his professional life, his views on language teaching in recent decades, and finally his experience and views on language education abroad. So I'll pass over to John now to welcome Mike and to ask him how he became a languages person.
Right. Good afternoon, Mike. We have worked together for a long time, in fact. I think I was trying to look. I think around about 1985 was the first contact. I wrote to you and said I was interested in doing research. And you very kindly came back positively, and it sort of has moved on from there. But we're talking about you. So, yes, how did you actually become a language teacher? Were there certain influences you can see right back from a child that perhaps influenced you, made you want to head in that direction?
Well, I suppose my favorite story, in a sense, one which I didn't tell until quite a long time into my career, was when my father was a tailor. He worked for the Cooperative Society, as it's properly known, in Bradford. We lived in Dewsbury, and he was a bespoke tailor. So that meant that he had individual customers, and one of them he told us about in one evening when we were having dinner. One of his customers was wanting a lightweight suit. And this customer turned out to be somebody who worked for the Foreign Office. And he was kind of indirectly told me about his life in the Foreign Office. And that immediately attracted me, see the world and so on. And so it was always at the back of my mind that languages might be the best way to find a job in the Foreign Office. That turned out to be, well, there was no career advice in those days. So maybe the advice might have been different. But anyway, I took languages despite the fact that I was actually better at sciences when I did O-levels. And I then did A-levels, advanced GCE A-levels, advanced levels in French, German, and Latin. And somehow, and I can't remember quite how, in my final year at A-level, so when I was about 17 or 18, I volunteered for voluntary service overseas. And I ended up in Algeria for a 1-year voluntary service overseas stint. And what did they ask us to do? Well, to teach English. So I became an English teacher for a year in a lycée, because it was 1965, 66. And it was only 3 or 4 years after the end of French rule, after the independence. So it was still very much a French education system that they were running. So it was still called the lycée. I think even today it's still called a lycée, but it was above all French people teaching. And I was one of the foreigners, not many, but there were a few foreigners teaching there. I was one of the foreigners teaching at the school, and I was teaching English. I enjoyed it eventually. I mean, the first term I made all sorts of mistakes, of course. We had a 10-day crash course in how to teach English at the British Council in Algiers before we went to our different lycée. There were 6 of us, I think, all doing VSO. But by the end of the year, I thought I was actually teaching people something and enjoying it. And in a way that decided me that I wanted to teach. I mean, that became more and more my career path. And the idea of the Foreign Office, etc., disappeared off the horizon. And that's how, in a sense, I moved into languages and became a language person.
Going to Algeria, of all places, particularly interesting and very, very different. So you had the chance to see things that were especially different. From the school level, when you did your A-levels and things, was there a particular teacher you found who was inspirational, who set you, for example, towards languages?
Well, it was before A-levels that I chose German. We had a strange system. You had to make a choice between history, physics, and German. And normally you were expected to do history and physics, but I wanted to do physics and German, and I did German. The teacher was not very good, to be honest. But we were in a so-called fast stream, and therefore we did O-level in 2 years, and it was really just exam preparation all the time. And he prepared us for the exams in a very effective way. The French teacher was more inspiring, and I had the same French teacher after the first year. Anyway, I had the same French teacher throughout my time at the grammar school. I mean, it was a small grammar school in Dewsbury, in the West Riding of Yorkshire, so I think there were 2 French teachers, and we had the same one for most of the time. And he was good. He was a traditional French teacher. We did lots of translation, particularly A-level. I can't remember very much about O-level course, but A-level we did lots of translation and grammar using the infamous, or maybe famous, Whitmarsh. I mean, Whitmarsh was the book which helped us all to pass A-level. There's no doubt about it. Still, in a sense, all the grammar that I learned at Whitmarsh still affects the way that I speak French today. But I can't say that there was an inspirational teacher. There were good teachers and mediocre teachers, but I found everything interesting in a way. As I said, I was actually better in terms of exam results in sciences than I was in languages, but that may be because sciences are easy to do at O-level. You can remember things, you can learn things by heart. There's not a lot of imagination required. Whereas French, of course, you can learn the grammar by heart, but you've still got to apply it. You've still got to develop your thinking and write your essay. So anyway, I was, as I say, better at sciences in O-level results. And my mother wanted me to do sciences because that was the obvious thing in those days. You be a scientist. But I was determined to join the Foreign Office and see the world.
Right.
So you went to Cambridge from grammar school?
Yes, so then Cambridge.
Yes, I applied for Cambridge, and it was in those days you had to do 2 years A-level, and then the Cambridge exams, Oxford as well, no doubt, but the Cambridge exams that I did took place in the December of your 3rd year, which of course nobody else did except those who were taking Cambridge exams. And it was at Cambridge when I had my interview with the with the Director of Studies, Robert Bolgar, Dr. Bolgar as we knew him. He said, he knew by that time that I'd applied for VSO, and he said, well, ask them to send you to a French-speaking country. And that's how I ended up in Algeria rather, not in Algiers. First of all, they were going to send Hu Starkey and myself, who I still know, and who has been a very prominent figure in language teaching and citizenship education. But Hu and I were supposed to be going originally to Niamey, but then the VSO decided that there was no British representative, no British consul, no consulate or anything in Niamey. So it was a bit risky to send two 18-year-olds to Niamey without any backup. And we got transferred, therefore, to Algeria. And Hu and I and 4 others ended up in Algeria, teaching in schools. We were all school teachers. We all became teachers of English for that year.
So then after that, you became a language teacher.
Yes, well, I did languages. I did what's called modern and medieval languages in Cambridge. And the first year was, maybe still is, very much a rerun of A-level. You did literature, the set books, as it were, and grammar and translation classes, above all translation classes. But from the second and third year, you could choose much more widely. Technically, there were over 70 papers, as they were called, that you could choose from. You know, everything from Old Icelandic to modern French or Slavonic studies or whatever. By that time, I was involved in and interested in Danish. So in my second and third year, I began to do Danish and Scandinavian studies and linguistics. That's when I met John Trim for the first time. He was the new, I think relatively new, head of linguistics at Cambridge. I think he founded the linguistics department. And he, at the end of my first year, because nobody knew what linguistics was, so John Trim advertised a time for us all anybody interested to go along to at the end of the first year to look at options for second and third year, and linguistics was one, and he explained what it is and was. And then we had individual discussions with him, and I told him I was learning Danish. I was in the language lab learning Danish. And he said, well, go and see the Scandinavian department. And I became more and more interested in Danish and Scandinavian. So I ended up with doing, in my final year, a French paper, 17th century French literature, German philology paper, history of the German language, linguistics, and 2 Scandinavian studies papers. So it was a real mix of things that I was doing by the end. But I then did a PhD in Danish literature. I was kind of, at that stage, I was thinking, shall I pursue my teaching career? And I did apply for a master's course, the applied linguistics course in Edinburgh, which was already well known and has been very formative for many people since. But I applied for a PGC / masters in Bangor because bilingualism was one of my things by that time. And one of in fact, in a sense, the only real expert on bilingualism was in Bangor at the time. And I said to my supervisor for Scandinavian studies, maybe I'd like to do a PhD on a Danish author who I'd come across. And well, cut the complicated story short, I ended up going for the PhD option, and I did the PhD immediately after my first degree. So that took me, I had 4 years 4 years from the first degree, 3 years in Cambridge and a year abroad in the middle of it as the third year, and then 3 years I was doing my PhD, 1 year in Cambridge and 2 years in Copenhagen. And then I started teaching. Then I said, well, now's the time. It was great to do that PhD. That was a real privilege and a real, it was great to be able to do something that you could just follow your interests. But I don't think I would ever have stayed in that. In fact, there was a job advertised in Danish literature as I was reaching the end of my PhD at the University of East Anglia, and I applied for it, but I didn't go for the interview. I decided afterwards, after applying, it's not really what I want to do for the rest of my life, and so I want to go into teaching, and so I got a job teaching in a comprehensive school in Kent.
Yeah. Before you go on to that, Mike, what was the author that you did your research on, Danish?
Tom Christensen. He's not a world figure, but he's certainly a well-known figure in Denmark. I mean, he was a dominant figure. He wrote all his main work in the 1920s. He wrote 3 novels, and I focused on the novels. He wrote one novel, which was his greatest piece in a sense, and that's what attracted me. But he was also a poet. But then he became a literary critic, and he wrote for Politiken, which is the equivalent of the Times, if you like, and was very influential in what he wrote for over the next 30, 40 years. Yeah, he was still alive at the time I was writing, but I never met him. He was, well, I did write to him. I never got an answer. And I think it was too late in a sense. He couldn't be bothered with this person from Cambridge who wrote out of the blue. I don't know. But anyway, that was my little digression into Scandinavian studies. And it served me in many ways because with a PhD, eventually, that was important, I think, in getting the job in Durham, but we maybe come to that later.
Yeah.
So what's absolutely clear is you already were encountering lots of different cultures and languages. So it wasn't necessarily a straightforward process. Danish, perhaps an unusual option.
Yes, it all came by chance. One of the other things that I was told in Cambridge when I was applying and when I got the offer of a place, but I was told my German wasn't as good as my French, and I should try to improve my German. This was before I went to Algeria. So this was before the European Union, so you couldn't just go to Germany and get a job. You had to apply for a Arbeitserlaubnis, a work permit and a residence permit, and I got a job through the central office in Frankfurt. They said, well, I was a student, and it was clear I wanted a job for a few months. And they said, you can either become a hotel worker or a farm worker. And I thought, well, being a farm worker, I'd probably meet more people than making beds in a hotel. So I got a job in the north, very north of Germany, on a farm. And well, I still go, well, I haven't been for several years now, since before COVID, but it's a place it was my second family, it became my second family. And in that family, the grandmother was from Denmark, but from the German minority in Denmark. So she spoke German, everybody spoke German. But everybody in the family spoke High German, which was unusual. Every other family in the village spoke Low German. But by chance, I ended up in this High German-speaking family, because she, from the German minority, didn't speak Low German. And I, of course, before I arrived there, I had no idea. But if I'd ended up in a Low German speaking family, it might not have been so good for my German as in that family. But I became interested in bilingualism as a consequence of that. And I wrote my dissertation during my year abroad, which I also had in that area, in a secondary school in the area, near to the farm. I wrote my dissertation, which we had to do during the year abroad, on bilingualism and bilingual education.
So you moved to school teaching after you'd done your doctorate. How did that come about?
Well, as I say, in a way, it was always a choice between Scandinavian studies and literature on the one hand, and wanting to be a teacher, and that experience of teaching and enjoying it in Algeria, teaching a foreign language, English as it happens. And I was by that time married, and I needed to get a job because we also had our first child on the way. But it's what I wanted to do, so I applied for jobs in my final year in Copenhagen. I, went to the Times, said the TES, and looked for jobs and applied for jobs. But I was also interested in adult education. One of the people I read for my PhD, one of the very influential people I read was Raymond Williams, and his various books on language and on literature and society. And my PhD was very much a sociology of literature PhD. But I always admired him and his work as an extramural studies tutor for Oxford. So I had this maybe somewhat romantic idea that I would become an adult education tutor. And I got a job eventually. Well, eventually I got a job in a comprehensive school, which was a community school. The head of the community school was a man called Cyril Poster, who was part of the community school movement. The community schools originated, of course, in Cambridgeshire. The idea of a community school is that everybody can go, and in theory, it never happened in my experience, but in theory, you might have had adults sitting alongside 16, 17-year-olds in your A-level class. It never happened to me.
Yeah.
But I got a job, half-time adult education tutor and half-time school teacher.
And where was it?
On the Isle of Sheppey in Kent.
An interesting culture, I understand, although I've never
been there. Well, it's an island, it's no longer an island in now that there's a permanent bridge and you just drive over the bridge. But in those days, there was a bridge, but it was a bridge which went up and down, one of those lifting bridges when a ship was going through the channel between the island and the mainland. So there was a sense of it being an island, and there was an island mentality. It was unusual, let's say, as a place to live. But I got the job. I got the job as an adult education tutor.
What were you actually? You were teaching French and German in these places, comprehensives and community schools and things, were you?
Yes, I mean, the 50% of my time, which was school teaching, I was teaching French and German. Yeah, at one stage I taught European studies. That's another story. And but the other 50% of my time was a combination of being in charge. Oh, not in charge of. I was assistant adult education tutor. I was in charge of part of the program, so it wasn't a teaching job. It was an administrative job and programming and thinking about what we should do in adult education. Although I did to earn a little bit of extra money because I needed some extra money to buy a house or at least get a mortgage. I did actually teach evening classes to adults as well, in French above all. Yeah, French only, in fact. So it was good. I had a wide range of, I was teaching in 1 week pupils who were 13 years old, because it was a 13 to 18 school, and adults who were into their 60s and much older than me, all in the evening classes. But then, after a couple of years of that, they needed somebody to be the head of languages in the school part of it. And they persuaded me. I was a bit reluctant, but they persuaded me to become head of languages. Therefore, I became full-time school teacher and left behind the adult education side of things. And in a way, then the natural thing after that would have been to remain in school teaching. And I mean, the advice I got from the head teacher and people like that was, well, now you need to start applying for a job as a deputy head. And I didn't want to do that. So I applied for a job as a PGCE tutor at Durham. But I did my language teaching for six or 7 years, six and a half years, roughly.
Mm-hmm. So initially when you were at Durham, there's a PGCE tutor.
Yeah.
The focusing primarily on research was something you moved towards during your career.
Well, yes and no. I mean, one thing, I missed the research when I was school teaching. I wanted to continue, and I did continue to some extent. I mean, during the holidays and at the weekends, I did actually write a book based on my PhD thesis. So that was published. And I did, during the holidays, I remember one holiday, half term, I went to Paris and spent the half term in the Bibliothèque Nationale, researching the work of Henri Barbusse, who was a communist writer of the 1920s. 1920s was my period, but it was, you can't do it except you can't do research when you're a school teacher. So that was the reason that I wanted to go to university, not to continue literature research, but to have the opportunity to do research. That was really important for me. And I, first of all, continued my research on bilingualism and bilingual education, rather than foreign language teaching, because I'd become interested in bilingualism during my year abroad. And so the first stage of doing research was to do a project back on the border with Denmark and Germany, back with my region where I knew well. And I did a study of a German minority school, an ethnographic study of a German minority school. Living there, did a bit of teaching while I was there, just being part of the life of the school, and wrote my second book about that.
I think we've sort of moved on to the second theme of our conversation seamlessly. You want to take it up from there, Mike? To John, I mean.
Yes, so absolutely fascinating, but you end up as a language professional, and you're at Durham, and then things really begin to open up as well. So do you want to talk us through about that time? I mean, did you have particular ambitions then about where you saw yourself going?
No, to be honest. I was more than happy to be a lecturer in education, and to have that time to do research, as I said. But then also I was still very much focused on teaching. I continued to teach in the first couple of years, at least, in one of the local comprehensive schools in Durham. I would go and teach a class. It's German. I taught German, in fact. But it eventually became too complicated. I can remember, going out on teaching practice to see my students on teaching practice, then rushing back to get to my German class in the local school on time, etc. But yeah, so I did PGCE, and that was the main thing that I did. Even though I'd never done a PGCE myself. I mean, I went straight from doing my PhD to getting a job as a language teacher in Sheppey, as I said. But it was influenced by, putting aside the interest in bilingualism, which took my research time in the first 2 or 3 years while I was in Durham. I then became, much more focused on language teaching research. And it had always been a worry to me. I can also tell you one of my little stories. I can remember one lad in Sheppey, by which time he'd be 14-year-old, came to me at the end of his first year at Sheppey School, where French was obligatory, and he'd been in my French class. And he said to me, he'd enjoyed the French class, really enjoyed it, sir, thank you very much. But my dad thinks that next year, when the options come up, I should drop French and do woodwork. That's going to be much more useful. And he was right, of course. What use was French to a 14-year-old in Sheppey? And so that made me think later, when I was in Durham, when I had time to think, which you don't have much time for thinking when you're a teacher. That made me think about what I'd been doing and why I'd been doing it, and became much more focused on the idea that language teaching has got to be educational as well as instrumental. And what aspect of it that is educational, as opposed to communication and instrumentalism in terms of communication, is learning about other countries. We did take our students, our 14, 15-year-olds, to Boulogne every year. It was £4 return on the Calais Boulogne, Dover Boulogne ferry, and we should take the kids. It was only good a half hour down to Dover from Sheppey. So we did try to show them another country as well as teach them language. And somehow that seemed to be the right thing to do. But exactly what the rationale for that was only became clear to me as I thought about it when I was a language PGC tutor and had time to think, as I said, in Durham. And I began to ask myself, well, what is the educational dimension of language teaching? What do people learn in addition to grammar and translation in my time, and communicative language teaching by the time I was doing PGCE work? And I began to delve into the ideas. And by chance, I was talking to a full-time researcher, as she was, Pat Allett, in Durham. It was by chance in the staff room. And I was talking about what I was doing, and she said, well, you should carry out some empirical research. Find out if, when you teach a foreign language, it has some educational effect. And again, cutting this complicated story short, she and I produced a project which was something along the lines, with the title something along the lines of the impact of language teaching on young people's perceptions of other countries or other people. Not quite sure what. And with her help, we we eventually got some, well, quite a big grant, in fact. I mean, for the time, it was a very big grant. It was the biggest that we'd had in the department, to investigate that, a big grant from the ESRC. And over 3 years, to look into the cultural dimension, as I called it at the time, of language teaching. What is the effect? What impact does language teaching have, in addition to any linguistic skills that young people learn? What impact does it have on their understanding of other people? The short answer was none. The short answer was none that you could measure. Of course, we carried out all kinds of measurements and so on. But on the other hand, the teachers we interviewed, I mean, we interviewed lots of students before and after they started learning French. We interviewed the teachers who were teaching them French. One of the team observed the classrooms over a year. I mean, she was in classrooms day in, day out, observing what was happening. And as I said, we interviewed the teachers, and their hope was that by teaching, they wanted to use that somewhat hackneyed phrase, broaden children's horizons. That's what they wanted to do. They really wanted to do that. It wasn't just a matter for them of teaching French language, but it didn't have any real effect, at least nothing that you could measure. And that then led into the next stage of questions. Well, what do we do systematically in language teaching? What should we do systematically in language teaching, which will have an effect, an impact in the way that the systematic teaching of language skills has an effect or impact? And well, that eventually led to my writing a book called Teaching and Assessing Intercultural Communicative Competence. But I wrote a first book which kind of delved into the ideas. That was going on at the same time, roughly, as we were doing the big empirical study. And then, as I say, wrote a book which tried to work out, in a sense, from first principles, what do we mean by teaching, assessing, not just communicative competence, which is the linguistic dimension, but intercultural competence, and therefore intercultural communicative competence. And that I published in 1997, and it's, in a way, it's become something that everybody, even today, I still get almost daily information that it's being quoted from the so-called ResearchGate. Yeah, so it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the essence of it.
So it's really about the place, well, part of it is the place of languages within the curriculum. So it's really interesting to look, because there is this competition for things like civic studies and whatever. And what they do, I was always a head teacher a little bit worried about, because there were certain areas that you had to cover. And yet language has this huge role to be able to do this, but it's not always clear. So your research was really important in terms of actually clarifying what the situation was.
Yes, and eventually, I mean, one aspect of what I called intercultural competence was what I called critical cultural awareness. So intercultural competence, putting aside the linguistic skills, which are important and which are combined with intercultural, but putting that aside for a moment, the intercultural competence consists in my model, which is a model and therefore a simplification. It doesn't cover everything that you need to know and be able to do as an intercultural communicator, but it covers the things which I thought and think are teachable in an ordinary foreign language classroom. So it consists of 5 elements. One is knowledge about another or other plural cultures. But that, of course, was what we always did. I mean, when I was a French teacher, the Longman's audiovisual French, which I used, had at the end of each chapter a little bit about France, which I always skipped over because it was absolutely trivial nonsense. I mean, you know, tell you things about how many nuts and bolts there are in the Eiffel Tower and things like that. But knowledge is certainly an aspect of intercultural competence, but there's also knowledge about how intercultural communication works. So I think learners should understand at their level something about, for example, stereotypes. What is a stereotype? How does it impact on your understanding of other people? What we mean by prejudice? And even in primary schools, I think they, in the right way, using the right appropriate methods, you can introduce knowledge about how intercultural communication works. So that's one element, knowledge. Another is attitudes, but attitudes of curiosity, not tolerance, but curiosity, interest in other people. If you're not interested in other people, then you're going to get nowhere. But that's not something which naturally comes. It can be also stimulated by teachers. The third element is what I call skills of discovery. You can never teach everything that people need to know, so they need to know how to find out for themselves. And I mentioned that when I did my study in the German minority, I did ethnography. So the idea of a language learner as an ethnographer, someone who can use the skills of the ethnographer, you know, traditionally, of course, someone who went to the South Seas or the Amazon or somewhere to discover other peoples. But those skills are just as useful in finding out about somebody, even in your own country, just down the road. So ethnographic skills was the model. Well, skills of discovery was the third element. The fourth element is the skills of interaction and working things out for yourself, and being able to compare and contrast and understand how other people might see you. And the fifth element is what I call critical cultural awareness, which for me is crucial. That's the educational dimension. I mean, the others are skills and attitudes and knowledge, which you find everywhere in intercultural communication courses, you know, in courses for training business people to go and sell their wares in other countries. Those courses exist, and they train people in knowledge, skills, and attitudes. But I added to that this notion of critical cultural awareness. The idea that you should, well, that we all inevitably make judgments about other people and therefore ideally about ourselves by looking at how other people see us. So making judgments is inevitable. What we need to do with young people is make them aware of their own making judgments and on what basis they make judgments, and be much more careful about how they make judgments. And be more critical about how they make judgments. Therefore, criticality is crucial. But I mean, that's not something which is limited to language teaching. It can go across the whole curriculum, but it's something which can be done in language teaching, in that through language teaching, you can look at how other people see you. And some of the projects we've done have been looking at materials in a French class, teaching French in an English school, using materials about England written in France. So how do other people see us? Makes us think about ourselves from another perspective, and that can be a critical perspective.
Yeah,
Alan.
It's interesting in the first version of the national curriculum, 1992, while you were writing your key book. In parallel, I suppose, because the first version of the national curriculum, as you know, was influenced by people like John Trim and work that had been done in Strasbourg and elsewhere long before we had a common European framework. And I was looking at it just now, and it talks about appreciating similarities and differences and identifying with different experiences and perspectives. And perhaps closest to what you've just said, use knowledge to develop a more objective view of their own customs and ways of thinking. So that very much aligns with it. Of course, if you look at the version of the modern foreign languages curriculum now, which is a couple of sides of A4, you'd have to scratch around to find anything to do with cultural awareness, which is rather a sad state of affairs.
That first document was really exciting because it was saying everything you wanted as a language teacher to hear and to see. And then the second document, and it was like the whole system suddenly came together and was locked into something with all the assessment procedures and so on, that really didn't leave the same kind of expansive element that was there before.
Well, the first version put a lot of emphasis on principles and try to not to be directive.
Yeah.
I must say, when I was evaluating this when it was in progress, a lot of teachers did actually struggle with how they should implement even the principles, even though the goodwill was there. So it may have been a little over ambitious, but it was important that was there. One thing,
maybe I can interrupt you, Alan.
Go on.
I can tell you a little bit about that.
Yeah, go on.
I mean, it was in the middle of all this process of doing the research and writing the books and so on, as you said. And I was working with people in Germany, Dieter Butchers, and with people in France, Geneviève Zarat, Alban. Of course, in France and in Germany, they were already much more systematic about their thinking about what they call Landeskunde and Zivilisation. So we organized a seminar in Manchester, and I'm not sure what year it was, but it must be in the late 80s, mid to late 80s. And an academic seminar for 3 days, supported by the British Council and the ESRC. All of us getting together, from these three countries, to talk about what we were doing and so on. And I wrote to Christopher Whittick, your predecessor.
My predecessor, yeah.
Saying, we're doing this seminar and be happy if someone would come along. I didn't expect him. I thought he might at best send one of the HMI, but he came himself. Not only did he come, but he stayed for 3 days. We had 2 days of seminar, and the Sunday was open to the general public. In other words, we advertised it to teachers in and around Manchester. And he stayed for 3 days, and he chaired the Sunday event. And I was really surprised by that. But afterwards, I mean, he was a really nice man, Christopher. And afterwards, I didn't hear anything more, but I think it was Lyd King who told me that what you've just been reading out was actually put in there under Christopher Whittick's influence. Obviously, he was chair. I think he was the chair of the committee that was writing that.
No, that was Martin Harris, the Vice Chancellor of Essex.
All right. Yes.
But it was a crucial part of the chemistry because
so
Martin was very open.
He was putting that in.
normally HMI did not write and things for they advised, but they didn't actually write it. There were certain sections of that where Christopher was invited to draft it, even though he was only there as an assessor. I think I can safely disclose that 30 years on.
Yeah.
But linked to that, one of the problems we all know in trying to teach modern foreign languages in English secondary schools is that you get 2 periods a week, perhaps 50 minutes these days, which is not much space to deliver anything in. And I've often wondered whether the intercultural dimension, you really need support from elsewhere in the curriculum. You need common cause with English, geography, history particularly, because you can't do everything in those 2 periods. You're trying to teach them the language anyway, as well as all the attitudes and so on. And I was going to ask, I made a note before we started, how deliverable do you think ICC is in a English, but should say British context, and where it has been well delivered elsewhere in Europe? What's their secret other than having more time and being more open-minded, perhaps, to other societies?
Well, I'm not sure, to be honest, how much there is in Europe systematic introduction and use of ICC. I don't know. I suspect if you will find it, if anywhere, in Germany, not least because I know that future teachers in Germany have to read my work. I know that because they, from a number of times. But I would. So it's not systematic, I guess, anywhere. All we've been able to do over the last 20 years is provide examples. But I can say that some of those examples, that I've worked with teachers in a number of countries, and there's one I can remember very well, and I'm still in touch with her in the States, who was teaching in primary, teaching Spanish with, well, it probably worked out at more than 50 minutes because she was teaching, I think, half an hour a day. She was the Spanish teacher and got the kids for half an hour a day, and only ever used Spanish. She was very systematic about that, very insistent on that. But now is not the time to go into great detail, but she introduced a systematic cultural dimension. But as you say, she was also in close contact with other teachers in the school, and some of the things that she couldn't do in Spanish, they would do in math. So she got the students to do little surveys of
was this primary school?
Primary, yeah. So this was,
yeah. But you don't have the same silos in primary that you.
No, exactly. That's the point. Yeah, that's the point.
Yeah.
And it could be also that in Germany, where most teachers have 2 subjects, there's more across the curriculum possibilities, but I don't really know what's happening. But I think the important thing I would say is that certainly already she was doing what I would call CLIL in the foreign language classroom. In other words, they were focusing for some of their lessons on content. They were doing little surveys, they were analyzing their data. And I've seen other projects with older students and university students as well, where it's nominally a foreign language classroom, but the students are not being taught in any usual way the foreign language. Everything is focused upon the content that they're working with. And well, we all know what CLIL is, but I better say content and language integrated learning is usually thought of as something where you teach another subject in biology, history, or whatever in a foreign language. And we've talked with Dorie Coyle on these occasions, and I mean, she did a lot of work on that. But some of those principles can be transferred into some of the language lessons.
Yeah,
we've got
it's interesting that you. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the teachers qualified in 2 subjects in Germany, because it's the same in Austria.
Yeah.
And my son taught in a school, I forget the term, it was 11 to 13, 14 age group. And the teacher he worked with most his subjects were geography and English. So he taught nearly all the geography in English, but because he was doing the 2 things, it sort of spread naturally across and pulled in all sorts of other social dimensions, because he'd got sort of social science perspective on things as well as a linguist's perspective on things. And of course, the Austrians invested quite a lot in that. I've just noticed at the clock, which always goes quickly when you're having fun. We've been going about an hour. What the 4th section, the international dimension, I mean, we've already started on that, but I mean, your international experience is extremely varied, starting off with when you were in Algeria, when you knobbed a lad, as we say in Yorkshire. You got your Scandinavian phase. Extensive involvement in Europe, and of course you did a lot of work in the Far East and Middle East with different teachers. I think what one of the things people would be interested in is 2 things. Whether you're talking about Europe or further afield, what do you think, and since you're part of it, forget modesty, what do you think that British scholars and teacher educators have taken abroad for other people to benefit from? And what do you think what have you found where we could benefit by thinking about doing it ourselves, whether doesn't matter which country, it could be Taiwan, China, Austria, Scandinavia, wherever. Any views on that? Because as a previous interviewee has said, our contribution to language learning internationally is undervalued because we don't have a desperately good record at home for understandable reasons.
Yeah.
So,
well, yes, when you look at the Council of Europe, before I became involved in the Council of Europe, which was in the 1990s, mid-90s, before that, most of the people contributing to the Council of Europe and eventually the Common European Framework were British, bringing to, under John Trim, of course, bringing to language teaching linguistics, applied linguistics, and systematically using their theory. I think that's what is most noticeable. It wasn't only British people, but it was numerically, probably at least as many British as anybody else. Just thinking back, and that has also been the case in other countries that I've come across. I mean, my work in China is similar. I mean, I don't speak Chinese. I have no idea what's going on in Chinese schools and universities, despite having very occasionally visited classrooms. But nonetheless, what they're interested in is I keep using the word systematic, but that's so important, I think, the kind of systematic approach to whatever it is, in my case, the intercultural dimension, but in language teaching more broadly, a systematic approach to using the insight from linguistics, from the going back to Chomsky and then on to Delheims and so on. All that has been introduced through applied linguistics people in Britain, John Trim and and above all, but others as well. What we bring back from that, I don't know. I suppose, again, I would go back to my school teaching days. I remember being invited by the advisor for languages for Kent to a meeting of maybe 5 or 6 heads of languages. And she introduced us to this idea of what eventually became graded objectives and tests. And I didn't know at the time, but she had obviously, I now realize that she had been to some conference or other. She'd been reading what was happening in the Council of Europe. This was before the Common European Framework, but the ideas were being developed. And the German book Vorwärts, which was written by Anthony Peck, was if you looked at the introduction to Vorwärts, the teacher introduction, so on, it was highly influenced by the thinking at the Council of Europe at the time. So in that sense, we brought something back through that graded objectives and so on. And that was, in a sense, the beginning of communicative language teaching in schools, I think. Don't know if you would agree.
And of course, Vorwärts was one of the series, wasn't it? Because it was Adelante in Spanish, came out of the same stable, associated with the Language Teaching Centre in York, and Eric Hawkins, and so on. Yeah. We're probably almost. Is there anything you'd like to come back in, John, before I ask Mike our standard final question?
Yes, I think it's been absolutely fascinating. I wondered if there's an area which hasn't been covered you would feel you would want to mention.
Well, with respect to this interview, no. I've had other interests, research interests, and in a way, those have now taken over. And my current research is on something quite different, on doctoral education. But I think we've covered what I have to say about language teaching. I don't have much to say, and you haven't said much about language teaching in England, let alone the UK, because I was very much involved in PGC. I was 80%, 90% teaching PGC in the 80s and through to the mid-90s. Then I passed that over to other people, and I was asked to be in charge of doctoral education, and I did lots of doctoral studies and PhD supervision. And eventually, probably in the mid-90s, I passed over all my PGC responsibilities. And that meant that I lost contact with English schools. Up to that point, of course, I was in almost daily contact with schools.
Yeah.
I did lots of work with schools, including John's school, and other schools in the area, which was great. But I wanted to move on. It was time I moved on to something different.
Yeah. There's one, that reminds me, there is one important dimension that we've forgotten. I don't think we've actually mentioned silt while this has been going on. Because in the 90s, 80s and 90s, you were very active with silt in various roles. So you were contributing to thinking and teacher education, perhaps not directly as you would be as a PGCE tutor, but you were in silt seminars with a whole range of teachers and other educators. I just wondered, since silt was a much loved institution in those days, whether perhaps you'd like to, if you wish, if you'd like to offer a word of what you considered it was of value to you and to teachers from your perspective.
Well, of value to teachers and teacher trainers, among other things, was the library, which unfortunately seems to have, disappeared. I know that there were various attempts to once SILT was closed, to pass it on somewhere, but the library was a really useful resource. And then, of course, the courses that they ran. My direct, apart from the little bit of contribution to courses and so on, my main focus through SILT was on language awareness, which is another thing we haven't mentioned really. But that was something that I got interested in when I was a school teacher. It was part of this idea that language teaching has got to be educational. And so I wanted the learners to understand language and themselves as language people. And I began to do things in the classroom with them. And I even wrote a little article about it. And I think it came through that article that I was invited. By that time I was in Durham, but I was invited to part of the language awareness group that by that time John Trim was the head of SILT. And John Trim invited me to join that group. And Eric Hawkins was in that group, of course, because he was leading the whole idea of awareness of language. So that was a really interesting time. But we've talked about the difficulty of language awareness. You know more about that than I do, and to what extent it could or could not be implemented. And it dropped out of the English scene or British scene. It's still an issue. It's still a language awareness association. There's a journal dealing with language awareness or awareness of language. But that was that was in the mid-80s. And that for me was the first time I really had intellectual contact with Eric Hawkins. And John Trim had been my teacher in Cambridge, but that was different. It was a teacher-student relationship, whereas when I was in the language awareness working group, it was a completely different situation. And that was a great stimulus for me personally to be invited to that.
Yeah.
But we all know what happened to SILT and what a shame it is that it was.
And to other networks. I think it's the SILT library had two aspects. It had a research library, but also a library of materials. They collected. So a teacher looking for a new textbook or a particular bit of AVA or whatever could actually, if they could get an afternoon off, could actually go to SILT and just browse all the stuff in the same room rather than going to an exhibition at a conference run by people trying to sell you things. So that dimension was important. And on the research side, I remember our good friend and colleague Dick Johnston, when he wrote the language teaching for annual thing for Cambridge for 20 years or so, he used to make an annual pilgrimage for 2 days down from Edinburgh to SILT, because it was the most convenient place to get all the stuff focused in that area in one place at one time. Of course, we weren't digital then, so you couldn't just press a few buttons and call it up from wherever. Anyway, I'm starting to press, which as an interviewer isn't supposed to be my job. So,
what Dick Johnson did, as you said, he wrote an annual review of language teaching research, which was really fundamental for those of us who were doing research in language teaching. And I'm sure it took him more than 2 days. I'm sure he did all his collection of data over 2 days, but then had to write it. But it was really important, and it was part of the function of SILT, the Centre for Information on Language Teaching. We must say
and
that.
Research. It's full title.
Research, yeah, that's right. Language Teaching and Research. So yes, SILT was an important aspect of what I was doing in the 80s and 90s. That's true.
Yeah, and influenced a lot of language lives of different people, not just the ones involved in this interview. Anyway,
well,
that's been
for me. I mean, maybe I should stop, but for me, I would want to say that it was the opportunity to work at the Council of Europe from, again, that was at the invitation of John Trim, who knew what I was doing. I don't know quite how he knew what I was doing, but well, I was publishing, of course, about intercultural and the cultural dimension. So that's how he knew. And he invited me in the mid-90s to be part of one of the workshops that he organized. And one thing led to another. And I found that extremely stimulating to be in that international body of people in Strasbourg, meeting people like Danielle Coste and others. So that was a highlight for me of all of that.
Yeah. Good. I think we're giving it a good go. Thanks very much, Mike. That's
yes,
been
thanks very much.
Very enjoyable. Even though I'm individually, we've talked about many of these things before. I think when you do this, you get a different, more rounded perspective and get different insights, even if when it's someone you know. So thanks very much on behalf of our both, and I think we can now release you.
Well, thank you both. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Allowing myself to indulge myself in all of these things again.